Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Mario Van Peebles' 1993 revisionist Western, Posse. Now, if you watched my video on James Samuels' The Harder They Fall, you'll know I really like Westerns about African-American protagonists. African-Americans were incredibly important to the settling of the Western frontier in the U.S., but they generally are left out of Western movies, or the significance of African Americans in the frontier is generally downplayed. We tend in Hollywood Westerns especially to follow white characters to the exclusion of African American characters, and we tend to follow Anglo-American characters to the exclusion of, say, immigrants, Irish, German, Swedish, people like this, as well as indigenous people, Mexicans, Chinese, all of whom were major presences in the Western frontier. And actually, this movie, Posse, starts with a sort of acknowledgement of that. There is a character just credited as the storyteller, who plays as a kid, he played a minor role in the events that he's describing, but he starts us out. He gives us this frame narrative. And one of the things that he points out is that the role of African Americans in Western frontier history has typically been downplayed or forgotten, even by African Americans themselves. And so this is one of the things that this movie sort of sets itself up in contrast to, is that this is because at the end we find out that the storyteller is being interviewed by some reporters or archivists or something like this, maybe historians, gathering, I guess, testimony of experiences in the Old West, in the frontier. So this is the story of Jesse Lee, played by Mario Van Peebles, who also directed. He's a criminal who's been sent to the army to serve in the Spanish-American War as an alternative to being hanged, and he leads this group. The villain is named, or one of the villains is named Colonel Graham, Billy Zane. Billy Zane, an amazing villain actor, really amazing at this. He's perfect for this role. He's kind of a racist, corrupt dick, and he sends Jesse Lee and his squad or whatever it is, whatever unit it is that Jesse Lee is kind of in command of. He sends them out on this secret mission, basically to steal a bunch of gold from a Spanish encampment. Graham is then going to kill them off and take the gold for himself with his own sort of posse of corrupt dudes. This does not go to plan. Jesse Lee and his guys defend the gold, and then they manage to get smuggled back to the U.S. with the help of Wheezy, who is Colonel Graham's very submissive and cowardly servant, who he treats more like a slave. We actually meet Colonel Graham in a Confederate uniform posing for a painting, so it's this weird dynamic there. But Jesse Lee and his guys get back to New Orleans initially, and everybody else is going to go party, whereas Jesse Lee's like, I got some stuff to do, then I'm going west, got some things to take care of. Colonel Graham and his guys show up slightly post-party, and Jesse and his men have to basically skedaddle out of New Orleans. They start going west, pursued by Graham and his guys. And we slowly learn more about Jesse Lee's past. That his father, David Lee, King David, as he's called, was a kind of preacher slash education advocate. So he had this idea that African Americans and indigenous people could build a town. They could build their own town where they would be free from racism, and he's kind of this Booker T. Washington type figure in some ways, where he's like advocating for education, advocating for hard work as the way for African Americans to overcome racism in the U.S. However, this does not particularly work out because a guy named Sheriff Bates, who is from, I guess, the next town over, Cutterville. Sheriff Bates takes a group of random white racist dudes over to Freedmansville, the town that David Lee has founded, and they beat David Lee to death. Jesse is unable to stop them, and so he does end up sort of attacking them. That's why he's condemned to death and then sent to the army. So that's sort of Jesse's backstory. And now he's gone for revenge. So he's one by one killing off all of the people who helped murder his father and sort of temporarily destroy this dream. Because actually when they get to the West, when Jesse and his posse get to the West, they find Freedmansville a pretty thriving community. Though it's not going to be thriving for long because the railroad is going to be coming through. And what Jesse figures out, which Sheriff Carver has already figured out because, So Sheriff Carver is Jesse's friend, who is the sheriff of this town, but also kind of a problematic figure. The sheriff of Freedmansville. So he's the African-American sheriff of the African-American town. In contrast to Sheriff Bates, who's the white sheriff of the white town. So, because the railroad is going to be coming through, the land is going to be worth a lot of money. But people have been periodically driven off their land, and Sheriff Carver, on behalf of the land office, has been buying their land from them. It's not clear whether he's paying less than it's worth. He may be paying them a reasonably fair price, but it's going to become a lot more valuable when the railroad wants to buy it. And so Sheriff Carver has been gathering this stack of deeds, and he and Sheriff Bates are going to split it 50-50, is the plan. Whether Sheriff Bates would stick with that, probably not, because he does later shoot Sheriff Carver anyway. So that's what's going on. The town is basically going to be destroyed by the railroad. Carver knows this. He wants to get rich in the process. He is also planning to marry Lana, played by Sally Richardson. Lana had been Jesse Lee's love interest before he, got sent to the army and things. She is still in love with Jesse, so they have that storyline, pretty standard storyline. And then ultimately you get a sort of, Magnificent Seven, High Plains Drifter type setup where the bad guys, both Sheriff Bates and his KKK posse, and Colonel Graham and his dudes, show up in town. The townsfolk have to take up arms. Jesse Lee plays a central role in defeating them. A lot of people get killed. Yeah. So it's in that sense, there's a fairly standard Western component. They do eventually win, and Jesse Lee is like, "Hey, because we've got a massive amount of this gold that we had taken from the Spanish in Cuba, we can rebuild Freedmansville better than ever." So that's the plot of it. I think it's a really good movie. I think it could be better, though. One thing I will say, my big criticism is we don't get much character development. Apart from Jesse Lee, we learn very little about these characters' motivations, about their backgrounds, about why they do some of the things that they do. So, for instance, we have a character in the posse early on named Angel, and he just gets shot. Like, he gets shot relatively early in the movie when they're in New Orleans, and that's just it. Like, he was there, and then he served no real purpose other than just being a random dude who was part of Jesse's posse. We don't learn that much about Wheezy. I find Wheezy a really interesting character, played by Charles Lane. I don't know if I'd said that before. Wheezy is this sort of smallish, sniveling type guy, but he also seems to be quite smart. And he seems to have read a lot of books, which we can tell partially because he has glasses, which, you know, in the Old West, in a Western movie, if you have glasses, it means you read. Because, you know, I have a PhD in English and I have glasses, so I read. I don't know why I'm getting indignant about that, but we don't learn that much about Wheezy. And he seems like an interesting guy. I'd like to know more about him. We have a guy named Father Time, played by Big Daddy Kane. We don't learn that much about him. He's got an interesting fascination with watches. He wears very nice clothes, but we don't learn that much about him or what motivates him, why he does the things he does, etc., etc. So it's a very, very ultra focused on Jesse Lee movie, to the exclusion of learning about the other characters, which I kind of think is a shame because I'd like to know more about many of them. The other part of this critique is that we don't really have much in the way of motivation from Sheriff Bates. Colonel Graham, sure, he wants money, he's racist, fuck him, yeah, great. Sheriff Bates just seems to be racist, though. It seems like that is the exclusive motivation, is that he doesn't like Black people, he doesn't like indigenous people. Probably doesn't like Chinese, Jews, anybody else, but that doesn't come up. What comes up is he uses fair trials to basically lynch people. And he is, in fact, the leader of the local KKK sect. So, and that's fine, in a way. Like, yes, law enforcement racism is incredibly pervasive in the U.S. It is systemic to this day. I don't disagree with that at all. But generally, I find that a little bit boring. If it's just, hey, I'm Sheriff Bates, racist. I'm gonna do some racist shit. There's nothing else to my character. I find it a bit one-dimensional. I'm not really thrilled with that. I'd like that character to be more complex. Because I like complex villains. Now, the one reason that I'm more okay with that than I might otherwise be, again, this movie came out in 1993. In 1991 was the beating of Rodney King. And so police violence against African Americans was very central as a national issue at that time. And so if we think about Posse, in a way, as a response to the Rodney King beating. We get several scenes where King David is being beaten by these white men, and we get a mix of camera angles where we have sometimes King David, we're looking down on King David with guys sort of huddled over him, swinging what appear to be axe handles and poking at him with torches. We see him sort of curled up, trying to protect himself from these blows. A scene that is incidentally recreated later on with Jimmy J. Little J. Teeters, played by Stephen Baldwin. He's the one white member of Jesse's posse. He does attempt to protect Wheezy when Sheriff Bates's dudes are kicking Wheezy on the ground, and Little J is beaten to death for that in a scene that is clearly mirroring the death of King David. But we get that camera angle of sort of above and that violence being directed downward. But we also get sort of point of view shots up from the ground where we see Bates and these other guys like poking at him with their torches, swinging their axe handles down. And it's not an exact analog necessarily for the Rodney King beating, but it's not that far off. And I think in 1993, that connection would have been very apparent to many viewers. And of course, we unfortunately live in a society where police violence, particularly against African Americans, continues to be way more prevalent than it should.